Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Today I'm going to show you part 1 on how I made this boarded or 6-board blanket chest using only hand tools. These chests have been around for hundreds of years but have recently been made popular again by the woodworking community. I saw one at an antique store and really liked it and thought it'd be a good opportunity to do a hand tool only project. This chest is going to be made of poplar, and I'll start by marking out the rough lengths of all the panels that I need to make up. I chose poplar because it's inexpensive, easy to work with, and the chest is going to be painted at the end. I wasn't able to find any boards that were 15 to 18 inches wide to build this project, which would be ideal if building a chest like this, especially if you were using just hand tools. So I'm going to have to glue up panels, and I'll start by ripping everything to its rough length with my crosscut saw. I ordered this lumber online a couple of months ago and it's been sitting in my garage ever since. And one problem with ordering online is you don't get to check the boards first and you're stuck with what you get. You can see here these boards are in pretty rough shape, really cupped. So I'm going to start by flattening the concave side of the board. I'm using a number 5 jack plane to do this with a heavily cambered iron, and I'll start by taking a couple of passes across the back edge to keep the board from splintering out when I start to plane away the material. I have the plane set to take a pretty deep cut, and I'll work across the grain, working myself up and down the board until I get rid of all the roughness and it looks like the board's pretty well flat. Once I think I've got the board flat enough, I'll start planing with the grain, removing all the scallop marks that the plane iron left when I was traversing the grain. I'll do this until I got a somewhat smooth surface. I'm not looking for perfection here, but I want to see the grain pattern and be able to match up panels well. Next, I'll use a set of winding sticks to make sure this face of the board is flat. I'll set one in the front and one in the back, and then I'll sight down the board and making sure that I don't see one side or the other of the back winding stick sticking up above the front one. In this case, there still was a little bit of twist in the board, so I took my hand plane and went back over it a couple of times to try to flatten everything out. Then the last step I perform to make sure that that face is flat is to flip it over and stick it on my workbench. I'll make sure that there's no shavings or anything underneath of it, but I know my workbench is flat, so I'll take the board, flip it over, and then try to press down on the corners and see if the board rocks at all. And it did in this case, so I'll just note where the high spots were, or the high corners, and then I'll flip the board back over, take a couple of strokes with the hand plane, normally diagonally from high corner to high corner, 2 or 3, 4 passes, and flip it back over and check it one more time, and that's normally enough to make it pretty close to perfect. Now I can mark this face of the board so I can reference it later. Now that I have one face of the board flat, I need to make one straight edge as well that's 90 degrees to the reference face. I'll do that over at the leg vise and use my sliding deadman to support the workpiece. The edge of this board was in pretty good shape, so it only took a few passes with the jack plane to get everything squared up. At the end, I took a combination square, registering it up against the first part of the board that I flattened, and just made sure that the edge was 90 degrees to that reference face. Now I can make another mark that attaches to the first reference face I made so that I know I got one good face and one good edge. The next step is to work on the opposite edge or the third side of the board. And my goal here is to remove as little material as possible, but leave a uniform width all the way down the board. So I'll take my panel gauge and I'll find the narrowest spot of the board and I'll lock off the gauge there and then scribe a line all the way down. It was only about a 1/4 inch from the narrowest to the widest part of the board, so I went back to the jack plane and just planed down to the line. And then just like the other edge, back to the combination square to make sure that that edge is squared up to the reference face. In this case, I could see a little light between the square and the board on the side farther away from me, so I took my plane and centered the iron over the edge closest to me and made a couple passes, and this straightened everything out. Then the last step to dimensioning this rough stock is to get that final face down to the correct thickness and flat. Since I want to keep these pieces as thick as possible, I'll take my marking gauge and go around the board to find the thinnest spot. Once I've found it, I'll lock the gauge out and scribe a line around the board the rest of the way. And now, just like on the first face of the board, I'll use my jack plane set with a deep cut to run traverse or across the grain to remove most of the material. And then I'll come back and remove all the scalloping and smooth the board out the best I can, working with the grain. I'll keep working down the material until I reach the scribe line that I marked out on all four sides of the board. Then once I've planed down to the line all the way around the board, I'll give it a quick check for flatness, and then this board will be done for now. One thing that I'm going to do different on the next 12 boards that I didn't do on the first board is to use a variety of different hand planes. If you go back and notice, on that first board I only used a jack plane for every operation. I just thought it'd be fun to challenge myself a little bit to use the one jack plane to do all the operations and get through one board at least. And then for the rest of the boards, I'll be using number 6 to kind of flatten the faces out a little nicer, number 7 to joint the edges and also flatten the faces, and then later on some different hand planes for different end grain and different stuff. But yeah, the number 5, if you're only going to have one hand plane or you're getting your first hand plane, the number 5 should be the one. And while I'm finishing up this next board, I just want to take a minute to say thanks for watching these videos. I hope you guys enjoy them, and if you do, give it a thumbs up and leave a comment, and definitely subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Alright, back to the build. So after checking this second board for its final flatness and making sure it's good to go, I just grabbed the next one and kept going and spent almost an entire day flattening all 13 boards. Now I'm ready to start gluing up panels, and the first step would be to match plane the boards that I'm going to glue together. I'll start the process by taking 2 boards that I'm going to glue up and put them on my flat workbench so both faces that I want to glue together are facing down or on the bench. Next I'll use a wood vise, but any clamp would do, to clamp the boards together on one end. Then I'll clamp the pair of boards into my leg vise, making sure that the board's edges stay pretty much level, and then start planing away the material from both boards. A number 6 or a number 7 hand plane would be a good choice for a task like this. I'll take a few passes until I get equal shavings from each board for the whole length of the boards. After I've gotten full-length shavings coming out of the hand plane, I'll go back and plane away just a little bit of material towards the center of the boards. I'm doing this to create a small hollow, or what's called a spring joint, and I'll just make gluing up the panels a little easier. Once I've taken all the material off I think I need to, I'll take the boards out of the clamp and set them on my workbench with the 2 planed edges facing each other. I want to make sure that I have a nice good tight fit between the 2 boards with just a very small hollow gap in the center that'll close up real nice when I go to clamp this thing up. I'll apply some glue to the edges and then clamp these boards together. With the spring joint that I mentioned earlier, the outer 2 clamps are really just kind of holding the board still, while the center clamp is the one providing all the pressure for the entire joint. I've read a lot of debates over whether a spring joint's a good joint to use or not, so if you're not comfortable doing it this way, you could just edge joint the 2 boards until you get a nice tight seam all the way down, and then clamp the boards together like that. Now that I've gotten everything tightened up, I'll clean off all the excess glue and set this panel aside. I'll repeat this same process for all 6 panels that I need to make up, and then let everything dry overnight. The next morning I'm ready to start flattening the panels, and this is a lot like what I did with the rough stock, except for that I spent the time with the single boards to try to get them pretty close, so flattening the panels and smoothing them out should be pretty easy. But I'll start with my number 7 joiner plane, and I'll run across the face of this board and even out the 2 boards to make one good panel. And then once I got it flat and nice, I'll use a smoothing plane just to kind of clean everything up. This isn't the final smoothing, but just to make the board look good. And then just like on the rough stock, I'll check this first face for flatness, make sure that it's good. Once it is, I'll measure out the thickness that I want these panels to be. I'll scribe a line with my marking gauge all the way around the board. Then I'll plane down to the scribe lines. Once I'm happy with the thickness of the board, I'll come back with my smoothing plane and just get rid of all the plane tracks left from the big joiner. I'll repeat the same flattening and thicknessing process for all the panels. Finishing all 6 panels only took me about an hour and a half, and that's mostly due to the time I spent up front working on the single boards and making sure that the glue up went well. The last step needed to get these panels ready for joinery is to get them cut to the right length and square up the ends. I'll start by using my low angle jack plane to square up the first end of the panel. I'll work from both sides of the panel, working from the outside in so that I don't splinter out or blow out any of the ends of the board. I'll check my progress using a framing square. I'll reference one edge off of the good edge of the board that I have and then look for light underneath the ends to see where I gotta plane off some more material. On this short panel, I'm able to use my panel gauge to determine the length that I need by referencing off of the end that I just squared up. Since I don't have much material to remove off of this end either, I use my jack plane to plane down to the scribe line. And then once I've hit the line, I'll use my framing square once again just to make sure this end is good too. Now that I'm finished with the first panel that's going to be one of the end boards, I can mark out the second end board by just referencing it off of this one. I'll lay the finished panel on top of the second one and then use a marking knife to mark out the length. I only had between 1/4 and 1/2 inch of material to take off, and I was right in that spot between using a crosscut saw or my hand plane to get it off. I ended up going with the hand plane and just planed in from either side to work down to the scribe line. I marked the width of the second panel the same way I did the ends by using the marking knife to scribe a line in. And then over at the saw bench I used my rip saw to rip this board down to its proper width. I'm using an old Diston handsaw that I just got finished cleaning up and getting ready for use. If you want to see the video for it, I'll leave a link in the description. The last step on this panel is to use the joiner plane to clean up any saw marks left over from the cut. Now that I'm done dimensioning the end panels, I'm going to start doing some layout work for where the bottom's going to go and the 2 side panels. The end panels have notches where the side panels attach to them, and they're going to attach with shoulders. So I'm going to cut about 1/2 inch off of one side of the end panel, and then on the other side I'll cut a little over 1 inch off, and that extra little bit's going to be to accommodate a piece of molding that I'm going to put across the front. I'm going to saw away the material for where the side panels are going to attach, so I'll start by scribing a line with my marking knife. Then I'll come back in with my chisel and remove some material up to the scribe line to create a ramp and a shoulder that the saw will sit in and hopefully let me start a straight cut. Now I can use my carcass saw to saw down to the line. I'll reposition the board in the vise and then perform all the same steps on the other side. Now I just need to make a couple more cuts to remove the waste from the end boards. Setting up for the cuts is the same for me. I'll strike a line, take a chisel and create the little shoulder, and then I'll use my panel saw to make the rip cut. On the side of the board where I was removing about 1.25 inches of material, it wasn't so bad to use this 6-point per inch rip cut saw, but on the side that I'm only removing about 1/2 inch of material, I had a really hard time making this cut. The material on the waist side of the cut split off about 1/4 of the way down. Luckily it didn't split into the board that I'll be using, so that was good, but the lesson here was I just really needed to slow down and take my time making the rest of this cut so I didn't cause any more damage, and then possibly in the future I'll sharpen another one of my panel saws to have a little more teeth per inch and make a little finer cut and make this a little bit easier of a task. Once I finish with the first board, I'll repeat the same steps on the second. So cleaning up these stopped cuts are a little bit tricky. I can't use a hand plane to plane all the way up to the notch unless I had like a chisel plane, which I don't. So in this case I just used a chisel and cleaned off the material from the about 3 inches out all the way up to the stop or the notch. I just took my time and worked down to that scribe line. And then once I got everything cleaned up there, I was able to use my hand plane to try to clean up the rest of the line. Every once in a while I'd stop and check the board for flatness, and then I'd go back, just alternating between the chisel and hand planes. By the time I finished the first board up and started on the second one, I had a pretty good system down. I used my chisel to pare away up at that edge, and then instead of the number 4 hand plane, I used my rabbet plane or block plane to remove the rest of the material. This seemed to work a little bit better. The smaller block rabbet plane was easier to manage, and the results came out pretty good. So I think this is a good place to stop this video, and I should be able to finish everything up in part 2. I still need to create the OG or boot jack profiles in the ends, finish up the sides, top and bottom, create some moldings, put some hinges on, and give it some paint. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and definitely subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in part 2.